So who's heard of AWS Catalog? So maybe I'll rephrase it. Who's familiar with AWS Catalog, Service Catalog, the service? Awesome. So we've got sort of a fairly not too well-known service. Who's using it in production? It's basically my team here, all folks from Latitude. So one of the key reasons I was really keen to present on this was share learnings, because I think it's an underutilized service, and it's one that we've used in a particular way to solve a particular kind of problem, which is probably a little bit different to how it's been advertised by AWS. So by way of introduction, just briefly, John Gomez, Principal Engineer of the Cloud and SRE Capability area at Latitude. And just a quick disclaimer of cataloging all the things. So I have a tendency of just really wanting to speak on something, not necessarily putting that much planning into what the talk is going to be. So for flexibility and getting excited about things, I do all of the things, interface all of the things, gRPC, all of the things. However, don't catalog all the things. So yeah. Very briefly, Latitude, the brand is getting better known, not necessarily for the greatest reasons when you are trying to IPO. We have a credit card, the 28 Degrees credit card, which is very popular. When you walk into a JB Hi-Fi, Harvey Norman, and you want something interest-free, that's effectively powered by Latitude. Really importantly, we've released a buy now, pay later, or an afterpay-like product. So if you went to Chadstone, Harvey Norman, you could buy something for $100, 10 weeks of $10 payments, and it's interest-free, so it's effectively competing with Afterpay-like product. So that sort of leads us into, well, what do we care about cloud? So I've been at Latitude almost 2 years, and I think sort of the buzzwords and terms up here, transformation and journey, will really resonate for people working at Latitude, because there's been a huge amount of change over that period of time, in corporate change, with new management in place and setting a new strategy strongly focused around digital transformation and growth. It is a really exciting time. So if you like roller coasters, come join us. And in terms of the workload on the platform that we'll talk about in a second, we're doing some really interesting things in the microservices, event-driven systems and architectures. Gernam, one of our principal engineers, is here tonight, so if you've got interest in that space, talk to him. And in the data space, there's a lot of interesting things happening. So from a data engineering, data science point of view, come and find out more. So CNP is one of the things that we've built over the last 2 years to basically help delivery teams move very quickly. It's very focused on, I guess, what we call cloud native, which has become a fairly common industry term around using the cloud to build applications and moving in a particular way, which is quite different to how you would build your traditional on-prem infrastructure and applications, and using as much of containers and serverless for particular reasons. Now, empowering development teams ultimately for us means build and run. So if you want to have teams that are building and running their software, they need a bit of help, and that's where the platform is one of the things that can help them. And last but definitely not least, security, resilience, and compliance are obviously really important when you're a financial institution, and typically they can impact your speed. So by investing in ways in solving security problems really well and using engineering approaches, we're doing that in a way that hopefully not having too much of a speed impact. So in terms of the platform, we've got a few different components to it, which we'll talk through, and we'll deep dive into Service Catalog. So tenancies are ultimately very in line with the multi-account strategy, which I won't or multi-AWS account strategy, which I won't deep dive into, but it's fundamentally about creating isolation and giving teams their patch, sandbox, non-prod production accounts, and creating that isolation so they can move faster. That itself does create other challenges, which some of the tools here help with. So Service Catalog is a very, can be a loaded term because it does come from a traditional ITIL background. We built something that we actually didn't call Service Catalog, but was a version 1 of our Service Catalog using API Gateway, Lambda, and step functions. So we're effectively helping teams get common infrastructure building blocks into their environments. But we hand-rolled things, and then we got to a point that we wanted to solve a few problems, and AWS Service Catalog, the AWS service, was a really good way of solving that, better than our home-rolled one, so we switched over for version 2. And Secure Pipeline is ultimately a framework for getting pipelines set up and shifting left in security. So ultimately, in the last couple of years, we've gone from not many repositories on our GitHub to, say, I think probably close to 600 today. So you've got a lot of pipelines. How do you manage that number of things? Well, you need to have abstraction layers, you need to have common libraries, you have things. So the framework Secure Pipeline effectively helps teams build their pipelines without having 600 different things to manage. So specifically looking at our service catalog, what problem are we solving? So there can be several problems using CloudFormation templates without certain principles being followed. So one of those can be reuse and sharing. So ultimately, you've got a use case, someone builds writes a template, you deploy it, another use case comes along, typically someone will make a small change, tinker with it, deploy it again, and as that repeats over time, you end up with a lot of sprawl. So that's one problem to consider, and then obviously as you're making those sort of tinkers to your template, you've sort of potentially got different things running effectively different versions of things or templates, and that creates a huge problem. So sort of consider this a problem with thinking about stuff as traditional infrastructure or templates, and we need to start thinking about this as software and products which will naturally evolve. So we want versions. You might want to follow something around semantic versioning or some sort of versioning strategy that gives people a clear indication of what are the building blocks, what version are they, and how are you evolving them. Interfaces, so obviously from a perspective of you've got something with inputs, outputs, just treating it like software, you have expectations around those interfaces, and if you're changing them, the next point around backwards compatibility is ultimately you want to avoid breaking changes. Sometimes you do have breaking changes and you want to help your consumers work through that, and that's where testing is really important for proving that. So through automation, whether it's unit tests, spinning up infrastructure, whether it's manually testing through test environments, probably you want to be doing all of that, and that's what you need to do to build software. Really important that we treat our infrastructure with the same level of, or same approaches if we want the things that we build to be depended, to be reliable. So ultimately, even if we are having things that are different versions, that doesn't necessarily solve all your problems, because you will end up with version drift. So you'll end up with different versions of things being used, and you need mechanisms to encourage minimizing that. So if you're building software, if you depend on lots of different things, you would have mechanisms of keeping your dependencies up to date. If you don't have that, over time you have problems. So same thing with our infrastructure. So really quickly, looking at the service catalog service itself, there's a concept of products, portfolios, provision products, and constraints. So what I'll probably do right now is just flip over to the AWS Console and then talk through some of these just using, because I'm not going to do a demo of spinning up stuff. I'm just going to sort of browse the catalog and give you a flavor of what that looks like. So, service catalog. Yes. Yes. So, is that better? Sort of better? So, you can sort of see, this is actually what I'll have to probably do is zoom into bits. So on the left here, the consumers of the catalog see a section products and provision products. So the catalog has an inbuilt concept of you've got people who are administrating the catalogue and people who are consuming from it. We changed that model a little bit, which I'll explain later. But ultimately, you see different tabs based on permissions or different buttons. So if we were to go to products, you can see here that there's a few things in our catalogue which I won't go through the explanations until later. A little bit of this, but you can see we've got things that are in a catalogue, and these effectively are the products that teams who have access to the catalogue can provision. So the products are effectively grouped into the construct of a portfolio. The portfolio is effectively a means of controlling or you would sort of control permissions, and you share a portfolio, not a product, and products could effectively be part of multiple portfolios. The probably more interesting thing, which I can dive into, is in this particular account, which, apologies for the Zoom not being so great, and the names not being that great, just because there's a lot of CloudFormation provision products here, with name generation being a bit dynamic. But we've got different products that have been provisioned into accounts. And if we were to pick one, so maybe ECS cluster, just because we have tended to update that a little bit, you could click it, you could see certain information, and you can sort of that might not be the best example. Let's just pick another one. Oops. Maybe I'll pick the second one if I didn't. Oops. It's, sorry. Hey, grab. Oh, anyway. Maybe I was going to go into one that maybe had some updates and a bit more information. So flipping back, what we do, so that was the console interface, where you can use the console to add products to the catalogue. So you effectively add a CloudFormation template as a product. You can also provision products, as we've seen, out of the console, and if we get time remaining, we'll sort of look at clicking through some of that interface. Ultimately, you can do all of that through code and CloudFormation. So we have a workflow which is around contributors to a catalogue not necessarily being one team or a central group of administrators, like your ITIL Service Catalog is probably designed around. And we effectively, with a Git flow approach, we would allow contributions to the catalogue, and obviously there's code reviews and process around that. There's also automation around linting and testing. When we talk about test catalog and prod catalog, is effectively saying that some AWS accounts would have access to the test catalog and the prod catalog. Some AWS accounts would have access to the prod catalog. So you can sort of think of it as a stable, unstable. Do you want your production accounts having access to unstable things? You've got choices that we leave it open to teams to decide. So we see this as something that helps ultimately build our engineering culture of collaboration and contribution in an internal open source model. And if any problems are there, we don't necessarily have single points of failure. Teams can actually dive into the source, figure out the problems, open a pull request, and contribute back. And what we'd like to encourage more of, and as we progress, like a lot of those products came from teams that were using AWS, working with us and effectively contributing things that then others can use. And from that point on, you've got potentially multiple teams contributing and making it better. So that's where, from a shared ownership model, it really depends on the product, who owns that. So think of it as, just because it's in the catalog doesn't necessarily mean if something's working or not, it's going to be some sort of supported in a 24/7 way. But the more things are dependent on, the ownership gets refined, and we basically improve products. So an example might be, something is provisioned, but it's got monitoring baked in, so you can expect something that is provisioned to be monitored by someone. So an example, which is probably a little bit, difficult to read, but basically in the last month we've had 8 different people involved in contributing to the catalogue, which for a fairly small set of engineering teams, probably 120 people is probably pretty good. Now, provisioning, this is an example of CloudFormation that would provision, in this case, a VPC, or what we've put there as a product name, Virtual Private Cloud. The artifact name is effectively your version number, and you provide parameters in a similar way to you would a CloudFormation stack. So effectively, you don't have to go to your console, as we've talked about. So that's probably a lot of context around what a catalog is, how we're using it. We've found it really useful, particularly, again, this comes to the enterprise context around regulation, security, compliance, resiliency. You've got this need to configure things, and it takes work getting things set up to a standard that multiple stakeholders are really happy with. And when we have a VPC in the catalog, we're going to be solving problems that if you didn't use the catalog and you were solving it, or you're just provisioning the AWS out of the box VPC in this case, you would need to go and solve certain problems that in some cases can be really tricky. So obviously with VPCs, if you've got certain kinds of networking structures, you want to prevent overlapping CIDRs. So how do you want to get the CIDR range that you use? Do you want to go to a central team, manage it on the wiki page, get it out of a database? Ideally, you don't want to have to think about that and just provision from the catalog, and that will be a problem that's solved for you. You might have other automation baked in around when you spin up things in that VPC, some sort of naming and service discovery, sort of effectively enabling a subdomain hosted zone. So then things that spin up, there's just patterns around naming. Or when you've created a VPC and you sort of want to know information about the subnet, where do you go? You can create conventions like storing that in parameter store. So basically there's customizations that you would want to do and rely on. CI/CD infrastructure is really all about giving people queues of agents so they can run stuff. This is very Buildkite focused, where we give people an auto-scaling group of Buildkite agents that Buildkite itself help release, and we sort of take what they've open sourced and wrapped it with a whole bunch of security features, mainly because you want your Buildkite Buildkite agents having least privilege access to systems. So AWS, source code, whatever it needs to talk to, you want to keep credentials short-lived, and you don't necessarily want every team configuring that in their own way. You sort of just want to have that done and that problem solved. So the ECS cluster, I think this will be a really interesting one in the future, particularly with increasingly seeing container serverless and things evolving there. But ultimately right now we're running ECS with EC2 instances under the hood, so there's a lot of work to do around particularly logging, monitoring, integration with APM, auto-scaling, and various bits of security configuration. So if you are running, say, a microservice, you need a VPC, you need some infrastructure to set up, to have your pipeline having the ability to do something. You need an ECS cluster to run something on. That service probably needs to talk to something else. The announcement around Transit Gateway and Direct Connect is something that, the example here is we've created a level of abstraction where a team might say their service needs to point to this backend. How that is achieved, there's a lot of abstraction and flexibility to change that to another pattern, say using Transit Gateway. Currently we're using a lot of effectively private linking to achieve bits of connectivity. So what we've found valuable using the catalogue for the really common things. I wouldn't recommend it for experimental things unless you're using it just to advertise the fact that you might want to try something, learn something, but there probably needs to be more consideration about if you put something in the catalogue, if it happened to become heavily dependent on, then changing that is going to create a lot of impact in terms of versioning. So do you really want to sort of put things that are more experimental in a catalogue? Probably not. So second kind of use case we've found nice is features of an AWS account you might want that AWS maybe doesn't provide. So scheduling instances to turn off would be one example, where we've basically left it to teams to opt in on having a scheduler. So you could provision a scheduler out of the catalogue and you can tag your instances, and that's effectively wrapping something that's out of, I think, AWS Labs. The Datadog integration is really, so we're using a lot of Datadog for monitoring lots of things. Datadog has an integration to suck all of the CloudWatch metrics into Datadog, and by effectively going to the catalog and putting some credentials in or following a pattern of where the credentials may be living, teams are able to just enable that integration. So what's next? Probably one of the really important things for us is achieving stability. So a catalog is, it's only really going to be as valuable as the products work. So stability is really, really important, and we're putting a lot of effort into generating data around other products working. So think of it as, it's great to have a catalog, but if you don't know your things are working, and if people don't have the, effectively the comfort that issues will be fixed and issues, effectively PIRs when issues happen and solving problems and reducing the number of incidents you have is obviously a really important thing, and that's where full transparency effectively through automation around all of that data and reporting on it is something that we're investing quite heavily in on the moment. Sumo Logic is effectively the tool we're using to aggregate that data and run reports on. So Lambda is a mechanism of effectively querying stuff in the catalogue. Every day it'll just dump out information. There's plenty of CloudTrail information on the catalogue. And then from a business value point of view, if we're effectively saying the catalogue has a security benefit, compliance benefit, resiliency benefit, these are things that we would want to track and get better at tracking. It's just quite difficult to track the value of those things. So basically what we're saying is, believe there is value, but track adoption. So track the number of things that are provisioned, track the number of deployments, the number of updates. Are we managing version drift? So are people upgrading? Are we successfully encouraging people to upgrade? How long does it take for them to upgrade? Those will be metrics that we're tracking. Some of this we're tracking now, some of this we're working on at the moment. And then ultimately, if people weren't using the catalogue products, it's not really a problem. It's sort of a discussion to understand why. But fundamentally, if that was happening too much, that's like great data to inform your product development. And finally, we don't want to obviously end without talking about some challenges that we've run through and just help people get an understanding of some of the complexity. So we've talked about portfolios and the concept of a service catalog portfolio. So that portfolio is something that exists in the account. You can share it to other accounts. Now, there's effectively a gotcha where if you're importing a portfolio, so you've got account A, account B, account A shares its portfolio with account B, so you've got your central portfolio. Effectively, you won't be able to use one of the really awesome features around Service Catalog, which is enabling that product to be provisioned using a different IAM role or a specific IAM role, which is part of a thing called a launch constraint. So there is an AWS blog called the Hub and Spoke model that sort of talks through how to fix it, but effectively what you need to do is create a portfolio in each account and copy products across to get around that. And that's, well, it's not necessarily by design, but that's the recommended way to solve that problem. Second thing is the service isn't free. So if you do have a multi-account strategy and you end up with thousands of accounts, you probably won't at that point care at your bill because you're probably spending too much, but there is a fee per portfolio per month. I think it's $5, and if you are creating a stupid number of portfolios across many accounts, that could be a challenge for you. And updating products, I don't really think this is unique to Service Catalog itself, the service. It's actually more about CloudFormation and updating stacks. So you fundamentally need to test, because most of the issues we've had have been related to updating products and how well that update process gets tested. So we've got 4 minutes remaining. Instead of jumping into the console again, it's probably a good time to take questions.
Anyone have any questions? A second.
Hi. So when you build an application, you probably use like a component model where you're pulling different products from the portfolio that would make up one sort of application. So is that something that the teams commonly do? Is that a sort of a pattern you can use rather than just pulling, say, an RDS or a Lambda or something? It's sort of a combination of a whole lot of...
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So I'd say the number one thing is that we would definitely describe some of the products here, the building blocks in order to run the application. We've been sort of referring that within the teams as, that's your base infra, like your base infrastructure, and teams are provisioning that base infra out of a CloudFormation stack. They tend to have that stack running across, say, development and non-prod and production. So that itself is a template that runs and provisions a bunch of things in the catalog. And then when it comes to their application workload, they would treat that a bit separately. So you would probably say you've got your account, you've got some base infra, you might have some account configuration, and then you've got, I guess, your application workload, which probably has two parts to it. You've got your state, and you've got to think about how you're going to manage that, and you probably want some stacks around managing that. And then you've got your application or your stateless workload and containers or serverless, and you would probably treat that in a way that is much more flexible. What we have done is not catalogued any of the application workload other than certain state components, and even that itself has been quite limited just because we're heavy users of, say, Dynamo, and we haven't had a reason to catalog Dynamo, or we're doing a lot of things in S3 and we're not cataloging S3. The Kafka you might have seen there is actually part of a POC, and we're testing things. We've built lots of automation around the security of on top of MSK, but we'll see how we go in terms of what more products. Like it's a little bit of I guess, a recommendation to catalog the things that you know will make sense. When it comes to application workload, there's some really interesting AWS blog posts around you could use it for that reason. We just haven't found it so useful, just because all of that automation is sort of baked into our secure pipeline framework, effectively.
Thanks.
Cool. I think one more, yeah.
Question? No? Anybody else? No? Cool. If you do have any other questions, feel free to grab Jonathan during the break. Thank you.
Cool. Awesome.